Hey there, lovely soul. Welcome back to Noah's Stories. Today, I have something soft and special for your heart. A tale of quiet strength, second chances, and the kind of love that finds you when you stop chasing it. It begins in a little town wrapped in wildflowers and whispers, where one woman's journey through heartbreak, snow, and silence leads her not to a fairy tale, but to something far more real. So get cozy, let's meet Clara Belle. In a small town called Eldenbrook, nestled among fields of wildflowers and dusty red roads, where the wind carried stories through the trees, lived a woman named Clara Belle. She was a candle maker, skilled, gentle, with eyes that still held a quiet spark of hope, even when life had rarely been kind to her. Clara was full-figured, broad-shouldered, with hands shaped by work, traits often misjudged by society's narrow gaze. But her heart was something no one could measure, a heart warm, forgiving, and still believing in love and goodness. One day, Clara received a letter. It came from a distant town called Frost Bend, Montana, sent by a man named Thomas Hale, a beekeeper by trade. His words were simple, unadorned. He was looking for someone to share life with. Not for beauty, but for companionship. That letter was more than ink on paper. It was a flicker of light at the end of Clara's long road, and she chose to follow it, not knowing what might lie ahead. Clara read the letter dozens of times. She wasn't used to invitations or promises, but something in Thomas's words, honest, humble, made her believe that maybe, just maybe, she wouldn't be overlooked this time. Maybe this time she would be enough. After many nights of thought, Clara made a decision. She would leave Eldenbrook. She sold everything she had, her oak candle-making table, the rocking chair her father once used, the tea set her mother had left behind. Every item that left her hands seemed to take a piece of memory with it, but she let them go. She wasn't just parting with belongings, she was releasing an old life. Clara packed what remained into a dark wooden trunk, simple dresses, her work aprons, her favorite book, and her mother's old quilt. On top, she placed the letter, creased and soft now, yet bearing the full weight of her future. The day she left, Eldenbrook was wrapped in morning mist. Neighbors looked on with pity, but Clara didn't falter. She boarded the train heading west, toward the distant town of Frost Bend. Through the window, she watched the familiar fields drift away, leaving behind childhood, family, and years of being judged by a body that didn't fit a mold. The train rumbled through snow-covered mountains, and the unfamiliar town appeared like a dream, white, silent, and bitterly cold. But Clara carried fire with her, a quiet flame in her chest, burning with hope, with the belief that if someone truly wanted her for who she was, then it was a beginning worth the risk. When the train pulled into Frost Bend, Clara stepped onto the platform. The entire town was buried in white, a silence so deep it felt like time itself was holding its breath. She stood there, her trunk beside her, breath rising in misty clouds against the biting cold. No one came to greet her. 10 minutes passed. Then another 10. Finally, a man appeared in the distance. He wore a wide-brimmed hat and an old brown wool coat, broad-shouldered, moving slowly. Clara knew it was Thomas. He walked up, eyes scanning her. When he reached her, he gave a slight nod but no smile. Clara tried to smile for the both of them. Then his voice came, low but lacking warmth. "You're not what I imagined." The words hit like a blade in midwinter. Clara froze but steadied her voice. "What do you mean?" Thomas glanced down and said quietly, "You seem like a good woman, but I was hoping for someone smaller, softer." His words, though softly spoken, landed like stones. Clara didn't cry, didn't argue. She simply nodded once, just enough to close the conversation. Then she turned away. Her shawl lifted in the wind, her steps heavy as she walked from the man who hadn't come to welcome her. No one called her back, no one followed, only the crunch of snow beneath her boots and a silence colder than the winter itself. Clara returned to the train station not because she had a plan, but because her legs needed somewhere to go. She sat on the cold bench, her trunk beside her, unnoticed, unacknowledged. Snow fell softly, dusting her hair, her shoulders. Tears came too, not wild, not loud, just warm trails down her cheeks, as if her heart was bleeding quietly. She had no ticket back, no home to return to. Everything she once owned had been traded for this journey, and now the man who made the promise had turned away. Clara didn't know what to do, but when her fingers went numb and her legs stiffened from the cold, she stood up. Not because she was braver than most, but because sitting in the cold wasn't the same as being alive. She picked up her trunk, heavy with both its contents and her broken dreams, and started walking toward town. No one knew her name, she had no destination, but she walked, because something inside her still refused to collapse. Snow thick beneath her boots, wind howling through her coat, Clara walked like every step was a quiet declaration. I am still here, I am still alive, and I will not disappear. Clara entered Frost Bend with snow-stained boots, one hand gripping her trunk and the other holding a heart freshly bruised. She had no plan, no familiar faces, but she carried a quiet pride and the survival instinct of someone who's learned to rise every time they fall. Frost Bend was a small, close-knit town, tucked between pine woods and snowy hills. Wooden houses peeked through the mist, streets were muddy and nearly empty. Clara walked until she found a small wooden sign, Pharmacy, upstairs room for rent. She knocked, her fingers trembling in the cold. The pharmacy owner was an older woman named Mrs. Emmeline, sharp-eyed, but not unkind. After one long look and a pause, she nodded. Upstairs, attic room. 2 weeks in advance. The room was tiny, a single bed, a small window, a wobbly desk, the ceiling sloped, and wind slipped through the old wooden cracks. But to Clara, it was a beginning, a roof, however temporary, against the cold. She paid with the last of her candle-making money, saving a few coins to buy thread and a small bag of flour. The next morning, before dawn, Clara walked the town. She visited the bakery, the general store, the blacksmiths, asking at each place, "Do you need mending? I bake. I can trade for food." She didn't ask for pity, she didn't tell her story. But still, people whispered, "That's the bride. They say he walked away after seeing her. She's quite large. He heard she cried at the station when the snow came." Clara heard it. She wasn't made of stone, but she didn't break easily either. Every whisper was a scratch, but none deep enough to undo her. She began to rebuild, slowly, humbly. Mrs. Maple at the bakery let Clara take home stale bread after she fixed an old apron. The blacksmith's wife, Elsie, hired Clara to mend clothes for their 3 children. Sometimes Clara traded small candles she poured herself for rice or a pouch of lard. She didn't speak much. She simply showed up. Steady, quiet, dependable. And that quiet presence started to change things. One day, she stitched a torn teddy bear for her little girl. The child hugged it tight, beaming, "He's alive again." Clara smiled, truly smiled for the first time in weeks, a smile not for anyone else, but for herself. She realized love may not have arrived the way she'd hoped, but that didn't mean she wasn't worthy of care, of value. Each morning, she tied her apron, pulled back her hair, and stepped outside with her shoulders squared. Rejection, she proved, didn't mean ruin. She didn't wait for pity, she waited for purpose. And slowly, things began to shift. Mrs. Maple at the bakery traded day-old bread for needle and thread. The blacksmith's wife smiled and said, "It's nice having another woman around who knows how to keep things from falling apart." Clara still didn't share her story, but through every stitch, every crust of pie, she showed something they never expected. That some women are strong, not because they've never fallen, but because they always rise. Clara began a quiet routine of passing by the stationery store on the corner every Tuesday morning, not because she needed anything specific, but because at that hour it was always calm. No whispers, no curious stares. The shop was called Moore's Mercantile, but most townsfolk just called it the bookstore. Inside, it smelled of old pages, ink, and dry pine. Every time Clara stepped in, it felt a little easier to breathe. The man behind the counter was Elias Moore, tall, lean, with dark hair and glasses that rested low on his nose. He didn't talk much and didn't seem to enjoy crowds, which made Clara feel safe. One morning, as Clara placed a spool of green thread on the counter, Elias glanced into her basket and saw a worn romance novel. "You read love stories?" he asked, his voice low, gentle, without judgment. Clara flushed slightly. "Lately, I need happy endings." Elias didn't smirk, didn't tease. Instead, he simply nodded. "I've got a few you might enjoy. I'll set them aside." And he did. The next time Clara returned, a book wrapped in brown paper was waiting on the counter, written across the front, "For C.B." "No charge," Elias said, his eyes fixed on his ledger. "Just bring it back when you're done." Clara took the book, feeling her heart lift just a little. It had been so long since someone had offered her something, without asking for anything in return. Someone had simply seen her. Since the first time she received a book wrapped in brown paper, Clara visited Moore's often. Not always to buy something, sometimes just to return a book, borrow another, or simply stand for a few quiet minutes among the scent of old pages and a calm she couldn't find anywhere else. Elias never asked much, but each time she came in, he had something ready for her. A new book, a gentle suggestion, sometimes just a thoughtful question about what she'd read last. They spoke, not long, not rushed, but just enough for Clara to feel heard. Clara began responding in her own way. She'd leave a small slice of apple tart, a pouch of hand-stitched herbal tea, or sometimes a simple note, "Thank you for the book." Elias never expected them, never turned them away, but each time he stood a little taller, his gaze a little warmer. One early spring evening, Clara sat by the window with her mother's old quilt across her lap. It had traveled with her from Eldenbrook to Frostbend, but now it felt like it needed more than just old memories. She began to stitch into it. A piece from the apron she wore when she first found work, a scrap from the shawl she wore on the snowy station day, a strip of deep blue fabric, the same shade as the ribbon Elias once said looked lovely. When it was finished, Clara wrapped the quilt in brown paper and carried it to Moore's. "I made this for you," she said softly. Elias unwrapped it, his fingers brushing each patch. "This is my mother's quilt," Clara said, "but now it's a new story." Elias looked at her, his eyes gentle like unread pages. "No one's ever given me something like this." Clara smiled faintly. "No one's ever made me feel safe enough to." As winter slowly retreated, the town of Frostbend began to change its coat. Snow melted into trickling streams along the roads, trees began to bud, and the air carried the scent of warm earth. For Clara, everything seemed to bloom as well, not loudly, but quietly, gradually, like seedlings pushing through the last layer of frost. Elias never asked about Clara's past, never mentioned Thomas, never spoke of the whispers that still drifted through the cafe or bakery. He looked at her not with curiosity, but like he was reading a favorite book, one page at a time, slowly and with care. Clara found herself looking forward to Tuesday mornings, not just for books, not just for the silence, but for the way Elias looked at her when she walked in, as if he'd been waiting for her, even if he never said it aloud. One chilly morning, Clara brought him a cranberry tart, tied with a fabric ribbon. Elias paused when he saw the gift. "You're very kind." Clara replied softly, "Kindness isn't something to be measured." He looked at her, not hurried, not hesitant, but with a gaze that made her feel seen, truly seen, not for how she looked, but for who she was. At the town's spring festival, Clara had only planned to watch from the edge of the crowd, admiring the lanterns and listening to the fiddles play. But Elias found her the moment she arrived. "Miss Bell," he said, bowing slightly, "may I have this dance?" She hesitated. "Are you sure?" "I've never been more sure," he said, already offering his hand. They danced, awkwardly but sincerely. Beneath golden lights and gentle music, Elias's hand rested at her back, hers on his shoulder, and for the first time she didn't think of the cold station, the trunk, or the words that once wounded her. There was only Elias, and the feeling of being loved exactly as she was. After that dance, Clara and Elias didn't say much, but hands that had touched, eyes that had lingered. Something had quietly settled between them. In the days that followed, nothing changed suddenly, but everything felt gently different. Elias began stopping by the bakery when Clara was helping Mrs. Maple. He didn't say much, just bought a loaf of bread, left a nod and a soft smile, but Clara noticed. He wasn't there for the bread. One afternoon, Elias asked Clara to take a walk around the lake behind the old church. The air was fresh, wildflowers blooming through the grass. They walked slowly, shoulder to shoulder, as if the world had no need to rush. When they paused beneath a tree, Elias turned to her. "Clara," he said, voice low like a spring breeze, "I don't know where to begin. Just, from the moment you walked into the shop, everything in me started to shift." Clara didn't answer right away, but inside her, something opened, like a flower waking to sunlight after a long winter. "I feel the same," she whispered. "You don't look at me like the others. You make me believe I'm worthy of being seen, known, and loved." Elias took her hand. "Then let me love you. No rush, no expectations. Just here, each day, with you." Clara smiled, a real, unguarded smile. Inside her, a quiet voice that had long been silenced whispered, "You are not too much. You are enough." She no longer felt like the woman abandoned at the station. She felt seen, she felt safe. She felt like someone chosen, not for potential, not for appearance, but for everything she already was. And that, she realized, was love. 1 year later, beneath the blooming cherry tree behind Moore's shop, the quiet place where everything between them began, Clara and Elias were married in a simple ceremony. Clara wore a cream lace dress she had sewn herself. Every stitch part of the story she had been slowly piecing back together. No grand gowns, no choir, just a few friends, sunlight filtering through branches, and soft laughter rising into the spring air. Elias held her hand, his eyes still as gentle as the first day. "I never knew peace until I met you," he said. Clara smiled, "and I just needed to be reminded that I was always worthy." They didn't promise a perfect life, but they promised to always see each other, as Elias had once seen Clara, not as the abandoned bride, but as the woman who stood tall even when her heart had nearly frozen. The quilt Clara made now lay across the armchair in the corner of Moore's. Whenever Elias sat to read, his hand would often brush across its patched pieces, like touching a soft memory stitched into fabric. And Clara, she still sewed, still baked, but now, out of joy, not necessity. Her smile was lighter, her steps softer, because she no longer had to prove anything to anyone. If you've ever felt left behind, if someone once said you were too much or not enough, remember Clara Bell, the woman who walked through winter and found herself in the sunlight of spring. And know this, your story isn't over. You too can begin again, softly, bravely, beautifully.